He said it was set up as a slideshow.
Just open one.
That looks like it might. That's a PowerPoint.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So is this? You think that?
Is this it? Is this it?
Yes.
Is that's the one that looks like a slide.
There we go. Yeah, there you go. So.
How do we move on this? Then you have to have someone in the audience how to. Yeah, how to. Do you know how to do this, Leon?
We can
Well,
just.
I did, but how do you get it to advance? How do you get it to advance without everybody seeing the stuff on the side?
Oh. Chris.
Yeah, Chris will know.
This is my.
We're calling it all the top guys.
That's right.
What we need to do is, how come, here, go down here, right, like that?
Oh, how'd you do that?
Do when he advances now.
Now you should just be able to push the button.
Yeah, okay, fine.
And you did it by, if you find a little tiny lector in his arm or
fine,
somewhere.
okay.
And I think if you just push the button, it
Which
should do
button?
it. Just this button.
This one.
Yep.
This?
Yep.
There.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
And then, is that good?
Yeah.
And then how do we go back? How do we go back? Yeah, exactly. Is it going the wrong way?
Yeah. That's okay.
Here, let me just do this real quick. We'll start back here.
Yeah.
Come on.
That's fine. That's
And then here's what you do. You just hit this guy right there.
okay. Wonderful. Thank you. You resolved the problem with the forces of production.
Exactly.
So it was going to be somebody.
Do you want me to show you how to turn on the overhead if you want to use it?
Yes.
Okay, it's really easy.
Okay, we'll get started. Thanks. Great. Well, thank you for coming. I'm Leon Fink from the History Department, and delighted to welcome you all to this last event from our class dismissed working group. We've had a lot of I think, very stimulating events through this year, and this will be no exception. I'm delighted to welcome Carlos Forment, who is a associate professor of sociology from the New School for Social Research in New York, as well as the director of the Centro de Investigación de la Vida Pública, or the Center for the Investigation of Public Life at the National University of San Martin in Buenos Aires, in Argentina, to join us today to share some of his recent work on the recuperated factory movement in Argentina. Carlos has, among his many publications, is a work first of promise, multi-volume work on democracy in Latin America, where he is sort of picking up where de Tocqueville left off his travels and investigations of the United States, and applying Tocquevillian approaches to democratic culture to Latin American societies. In the first case, focused on Mexico and Peru. Today, Carlos Forment is drawing from a work called Argentina's Recuperated Factory Movement, Neoliberal Globalization and Citizenship, an Arendtian perspective. I should mention that his visit is, in addition to the Institute for the Humanities, his visit is co-sponsored by the History Department, the Political Science, and International Studies programs. The format is Carlos is going to offer an initial presentation. I'll, with the advantage of the text in advance, I'll start the discussion with a few comments, and then we'll just open it up for more general give and take. Carlos, welcome.
Thank you all for being here, and of course I'm very indebted and grateful to the Institute. It's really a very beautiful place. I envy all of you. And my particular thanks go to Suzanne Levine and Leon Fink, and as well as Linda, who's been tremendously helpful, including with the presentation. The presentation today is actually, in fact, the title is called "It Changed," as everything does in life. It's called Communitarian Cosmopolitanism. And you know, nowadays there's all this discussion about cosmopolitans, and you had to read Kant, and you had to be. And I'm trying to show that there's a kind of cosmopolitanism from below, and of which I think these workers are exemplify this. This piece that I'm presenting today is a chapter of a book that's called Citizenship and Its Fragments. And the subtitle is Argentine Democratic Life in the Wake of Globalization. And the point of this is actually, the whole point of the book is to study the fragments. What happens to these fragments? The idea being that Argentina, as you know, prior to globalization had a very strong populist tradition in Latin America, perhaps one of the strongest. And one of the byproducts of populism is you have really a very strong notion of citizenship. Even when I teach now at the New School, notions of citizenship rights, some of my students have a very difficult time understanding what this means, partly because there's such a diluted understanding of citizenship in the US. And so just to convey citizenship rights is in effect quite an effort. For example, in Argentina you have public health, it's guaranteed. This is a relatively poor country in relations to the US, so it's not a problem of money. We're talking about something else here. This is a political imaginary. Why is it that some countries have a very developed sense of citizenship rooted in a political imaginary and others not? This is a symbolic problem, and to me this is what politics is. Politics, I think, is the way society thinks about itself. And what I'm trying to show is what happened to the political imaginary in Argentina. And I'm doing so rather than taking on the issue of citizenship, I'm doing it from its fragments. So I'm studying, so all of these would be individual chapters, some of them published in the forms of articles. I study football clubs. Believe it or not, Buenos Aires has the largest number of A-division football clubs on the planet Earth. They're all, by the way, none of them are corporations. Like in the US, sports clubs are corporations. In England, in Germany, in Italy, in France. In Argentina, they're actually associations. They're voluntary associations rooted in neighborhoods. They have incredibly dense histories. They're very important. So one chapter is on football clubs and what happened to football clubs under neo-globalization. Basically, the argument there is that for the first time, Buenos Aires is a very leftist city, and for the first time in the history of Buenos Aires, a mayor was elected that's far right. This had never happened before. And so to me, the puzzle was, how come in the middle of these neighborhood assemblies, I mean, the city of Buenos Aires really was, there was an effervescence that was unusual. In the middle of all this leftist and radical activity, a right mayor comes to power. How come? And the argument is that football clubs became models of and models for politics. Why? Because the mayor who became president, who became mayor, was the president of a football club. And so football became a metaphor for understanding politics, because the same way that the football clubs were able to survive globalization by exporting talent, etc., to Messi, for example, in Barcelona would be an example. Each time they would export a player, income would arrive to the football club. The idea was that if football clubs were able to do this, the city of Buenos Aires would be able to devise strategies to survive globalization. So I study football clubs, urban scavengers, gated communities, NGOs, unemployed strikers, piqueteros, some of you probably know. And now La Salada, which is the largest informal market, it beat Tepito in Mexico recently. And it's now in the, it's under the gaze of the European Union and the World Trade Organization, as well as the US trade representatives, because of course many of these are counterfeit brands. So I'm trying to understand what happened. The public landscape has now been populated by new groups. I mean, each, as you know, historically, groups surface and disappear from the public landscape at different moments. I'm only interested in studying those groups that appeared under conditions of globalization. And furthermore, I'm also interested in understanding how they construe citizenship and democracy. So these are, in a sense, the center of gravity of the paper. I'm very proud, this is the first time in my life I do a slideshow. My daughter said I had to modernize myself, so I followed her advice. You see? How does this work? There we go. I'm just going to run them quickly so you can get a feel for. This is Imprenta Chilabet, which is a printing press. This is building. This is a shot from the second building. This is Bruckmann. You know, the take by, this would be where the take was filmed. Mostly women, I think something like 80% women. This is Impa, which is a metallurgical plant in the middle of the city. This is like the metallurgical plant. This is like the pride and joy of Peronist and populist industrialization. This is a very important plant. This is another shot of Impa. This is, they have a school. There's a school there, which I'll talk about a little bit. This would be what a typical demonstration would look like. This is Yaguané. It's South America's largest slaughter plant, frigorífico. Rough people, these meat packers. This is what a typical assembly would look like, which I'll talk about. This is, keep this image in mind because it alludes to a particular discussion in the paper. This is Yaguané workers surrounding a courthouse, and they smoked out the judges and their staff. This would be a shoe factory in assembly, and I'll tell you a little bit what these discussions are about throughout the paper. This is Bowen. It's a very important hotel in the center of the city, and again, a lot of these, please keep them in mind because they allude to certain discussions we're going to have in the paper. Bowen is in the middle of the city of Buenos Aires. It's a 4-star hotel. It was taken over by the workers, and they have absolutely fabulous street theaters. They basically put out as if it were a typical room from the hotel in the middle of the street, and they lie down and invite pedestrians to come in and sit with them and talk and discuss the situation of the hotel. It's very clever. This is the MNFRs, a network. There are 2 networks that organize all the factories. This is one of them, and they meet periodically to discuss factory-wide as well as network-wide problems. This would be the 6th anniversary meeting of the factories. These are the kinds of marches that occur through the streets, because one of the points I'm trying to get across is that these are not just factory specific. The whole point of the paper is actually to show how factories travel from factory to civil society to political society to the transnational domain, and see if we can make the linkages and the bridge between each of these microsites. These is, the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, which lent credibility, especially during the elections, which were very important. The factories got to, they put forward a slate of candidates, and 2 of the candidates won, one for city legislature, the other one for mayor of a provincial town, and that's it. So let's now I'm going to try and let you hear some of the voices of the workers. I think some of them are very telling and very eloquent, more so than, thank you, more so than what I can be. So I'd like to let you hear some of these voices. When I asked Ricardo why he and some of his co-workers at Gelco, a food processing plant with 50 or so workers, had decided in May 2002, in the midst of Argentina's worst socioeconomic debacle, and believe me, Argentina has many, so if this is the worst, we're in good company, to recuperate their factory after the owner had filed for bankruptcy, he responded, "If we had not done so, we would have been unemployed, and at our age, they're roughly late 40s, 50s, late 50s, it would have been impossible to find another job. Anyone who is jobless is treated like garbage. Look at the piqueteros, these are these unemployed strikers. Restarting the factory enabled me to regain my dignity." After pressing Ricardo several more times, I don't know if any of you have done interviews with workers, but it's like pulling teeth, and it takes forever just to get a phrase that in an academic setting you can cite. But once they're able to articulate it, they're incredibly eloquent. After pressing Ricardo to clarify the meaning of this last phrase, that is to say, regain my dignity, he replied, "Whenever I talk to the piqueteros in my neighborhood, they always tell me that they should have stayed put and recuperated their factory. All of them are now receiving planes," this is welfare relief, "from the government, but this makes them feel like shits, like real nobodies. They lost their place in, and I put in parentheses, they've lost their place in public life the moment they abandon their factory. Many of the factory workers that I interviewed use strikingly similar terms rooted in civic recognition and political belonging to describe their own situation, as well as the plight of unemployed piqueteros who had been stripped of their rights to have rights. To borrow Hannah Arendt's phrase, these workers were as fearful of losing their job as they were of losing their place in the world, their worldliness, again in Arendtian terms. This essay seeks to understand how Buenos Aires' recuperated factory workers, in the course of engaging in direct participatory as well as indirect forms of representational democracy across both the domestic and the transnational domain, generated the social, political, legal, economic, and narrative resources that they needed to transform themselves from pariahs into really existing citizens. In tracking these practices across various microsites, I have accentuated the ways that these workers recycled the material and the symbolic resources of neoliberalism in order to generate new forms of democratic life. Studying these practices is also an opportunity to explore some of the subterranean connections that have now developed between democratic life and globalization. It's an issue which continues to elude and confound those of us who study everyday forms of politics. Whether the experience of Buenos Aires' factory workers can shed light on similar cases both across the globalized South as well as the Eurozone, Spain, Greece's indignados, and that now also the People's Republic of China remains to be seen. In analyzing this relationship between democracy and neoliberalism, I focused on the interpretive practices of factory workers, in part because most scholars continue to downplay or ignore them, granting centrality instead to other aspects, including, and this is some of Padurai's work, and there are a bunch of other people here, Saskia, Sassoon, et cetera, including media, technological and financial flows, cosmopolitan norms, networks of globalized cities, transnational organizations, international migration, as well as anti-globalization forums and movements. All of these approaches have trained our attention on key aspects of democratic life under neoliberalism. However, they have also served to obscure other equally important ones. It's as if workers don't think. It's as if workers don't have the capacity to generate their own ideas. And so all of a sudden, the only ones who talk and speak are really either NGOs or IMF or the forums that everyone hears about. And the people who are actually living this are deaf, dumb, and mute. And that's what I'm in part reacting to. Instead of construing neoliberal globalization as an anonymous structural force imposed from without and from above, or part of a prescripted, completely predictable narrative written in the universal language of anti-capitalism, anti-capitalist resistance, human rights, or NGO empowerment, which is the lingo one hears all the time. What I'm trying to do is to figure out how it is that, in fact, workers made sense of neoliberalism. To me, neoliberalism is like a screen, and you need to figure out how it is that the workers themselves are projecting their experiences, and in doing so are actually, screen perhaps is not the correct metaphor, because what they're actually doing is transforming the screen altogether. My essay is in 5 parts. The first is a very quick overview of the debacle. What did it mean to undergo globalization? The second, I look at key institutions of the state, civil society, and the public sphere, and how all of them, in one way or another, contributed to invisibilizing the factory workers. Again, I borrow here from some of Rancier's work that politics is about how do you make something that is invisible visible. How it is that a society goes about excluding the part, and how it is that the part then demands to become part of the whole, although they've been altogether marginalized and invisibilized. The third part will study the way workers carved a niche for themselves in public life by engaging in communitarian practices, first within the factory and then also civil society. Then in the next section, which would be the fourth, I look at the way factory workers engage in politics, communitarian forms of politics across political society. And the fifth, I look at the transnational linkages between the factories and the European community on the one hand, as well as ALBA, on the other. And in the closing remarks, I'm going to make some very polemical, indefensible, speculative, non-substantiated claims about what I think is going on and what I think globalization is about. So if you hit me with facts, I can't answer. If you hit me with equally outrageous commentaries, then we can engage. So let's get moving into the first part, which would be just the sketch. What was this debacle about? Beginning in the mid-1980s, the Argentine state, under intense and sustained pressure from the IMF, World Bank, and so on, implemented a wide-ranging set of policies aimed at transforming the country into a market-centered society. I remind you here of Polanyi's work. This was accomplished far more thoroughly and in a shorter span of time than any other South American country. And here I would even include Chile in this list, which was, it also undertook quite an impressive transformation. Salaried workers in Buenos Aires' greater metropolitan region were among the first to experience the full force of this transformation. By the end of 2003, roughly 25% of all the workers in the region were jobless. Another 10% were unemployed. No fewer underemployed. No fewer than 35% who still had jobs now worked in the informal sectors. In Argentina, the informal sector, had a conversation with Leon. In India, for example, it's very common. In Argentina, the informal sector had always been relatively small. We're talking about 6%. So it jumped from 6% to what I said, 35%. Roughly 60% of the population was now classified as poor. Another 27% was indigent. Relative inequality reached just astonishing levels. This was, again, sociologists have this little thing called Gini coefficient. It measures the spread. So this was considered to be the single largest transfer of wealth from the poor, working class, and middle class to the elites. It broke all records in the history of Argentina. Now, despite these dire conditions, and here again, if I may take a jab at my colleagues in sociology and political science, there was no opportunity structure. You know, sociologists think that if you have an opportunity structure, it's like a little window, you open up, the breeze comes in, and things happen. Well, there was no opportunity structures, and yet things happened. So we can't really reduce this to the famous opportunity structure argument. 80% of all the factories are concentrated. Let me give you just a pictorial depiction of it. In the greater metropolitan region, this is what you see there. Buenos Aires would be here, the capital. This would be the greater metropolitan area, which would be the Cinturón. Everything here, when I went to, this is where Yaguané, the slaughterhouse is located. If you crossed into here, believe it or not, you start seeing, at least in this time when I did my research, there were no cars, there were no buses, people were riding carts. Buenos Aires is a very deceptive city. The city itself, the capital, is very cosmopolitan, very European, very sophisticated. But as you move out, you leave that behind, and really you enter deep South America. You leave behind the tinsel and the beauty of Buenos Aires. Is really a stunningly beautiful city, but you enter what really is the Argentina. It's interesting. Some cities, the link between the countryside, the rest of the country, and the capital are very tight. Like I think Mexico City is one of them. I think Lima, Peru is another one. But then there are other capitals that are completely disconnected from the hinterlands, which I think is in itself a very interesting project to look into. No one knows with any degree of certainty, and here I spent many, many weeks in the Ministry of Labor just talking to people and looking at numbers of really how many workers work in these factories. The best estimates that anyone gave me was about 22,000. So we're not talking really about a very large group of people. But in my case, it doesn't really matter, because what I'm after, I mean, these factories are clearly, they're not going to transform the socioeconomic capacity of the country. That's not what I'm after. What I'm really after is really, how did the factories alter the symbolic landscape? How did they restructure the collective imaginary? And this is really where I do think the factories are very significant. So it's not a numerical problem, it's not an economic problem, it's not a social problem. We're talking about a symbolic problem here. Let's move to the next part of the essay of how it was that these factories became invisibilized. Again, this is Rancier's claim, is how it is that a society keeps an open secret to itself. How do people all of a sudden become invisible? So my claim is that the institutions that are normally used in democratic regimes to defend the most vulnerable sectors, the institutions of civil society like unions, political parties and political society, newspapers in the public sphere, the almighty Habermasian public sphere, all of them, as far as I'm concerned, work to invisibilize workers, every single one of them. And let me give you a few examples. In 1995, beginning with the judiciary courts, the Minister of Economics at the time under President Menem, which was, as you recall, Domingo Cavallo, he secured congressional approval for a law that was called the Law of Insolvency and Bankruptcy. This is an astonishingly important law. It signaled to investors and financial agencies alike that the Argentine government now had the legal mechanisms, in addition to the political will, to turn the country into a market-centered society. This is important, again, because globalization is thought of as an economic or a technical or a cultural flows, and it's also a legal juridical problem that's very complex. I don't have training in law. It took me months of reading all sorts of very technical legal decisions and talking to lawyers to even begin understanding, and I don't quite fully understand the implications of it. But it worked its way through the country, partly through the legal system. The legal system, to me, is part of the imaginary. I mean, I don't give greater credence or importance to law than I would to any other part of the symbolic domain. To me, it constitutes part of the imaginary of a country. Pedro Kesselman, who in 1994 contributed to reforming the national constitution, after the dictatorship, he was a crucial figure in the constitutional reform of the period, summarized the consequence of this law. He says on the following, this is a quote: "Our civil and commercial judges are concerned solely with property rights. They view them now as sacrosanct, as if the rights of the creditors are the only ones worth defending. These judges ignore the rights of workers who, after all, have suffered the most in cases always of insolvency and bankruptcy. Neoliberal notions of property rights now became the language, the idiom of juridical life, and forcing judges, lawyers, plaintiffs, defendants, including factory workers, to speak in these terms. If you didn't speak in these terms, you could not be understood. It was impossible to present your case. So you really need to, this is a problem of translation. How do you go from being workers who are interested in social rights to using the language of property rights to get around eventually to being able to put forward your argument? This is very complicated. Under neoliberalism, the judiciary, like all the other wings of the state, slashed its budget and reduced its personnel, requiring judges to outsource and privatize the task of dispensing judges. The judges, what they did is they went to private accounting firms and they contracted accountants. These were called trustees. And they gave these trustees the responsibility of monitoring these factories when they went bankrupt. What happened is that these accountants struck deals with the ex-owners or the bankrupt owners, depending on the case, so that they would be able to, for example, under the cover of night, take out their machinery and tools. And when the factory went up for auctions, the old owners already had all their the machinery in a new warehouse, getting ready to open up a new factory. They did all sorts of things, which I won't go into detail, but there were all sorts of things going on of this sort. Another way that, so we have the legal invisibilization of the workers through the idiom of property rights and the way the entire law was implemented. We also have unions. Argentine unions up until now had been really very radical, very militant. Again, a legacy of populism. During the debacle, the CGT, the largest confederation, under pressure from the minister, what they did is that the confederation sent out all its shop stewards, and they told the shop stewards, if you have a situation of a recuperation, just tell all the workers, they gave them instructions to the shop stewards, tell all the workers to negotiate a severance package and just get out of the factory, and that's it. Now, what happened is that, as you know, unions depend on dues from their membership, and it's the owners who actually collects the dues from the workers. So what happened is that the owners would tell the unions, if you guys support the factories, we're no longer going to collect union dues from your workers, and therefore you're going to go bankrupt. So a lot of the unions figured out that they couldn't really exert much leverage. The third form of invisibilization occurred in the political field. Here, the upper and lower chamber of the National Congress, which is constituted by the three most important political parties, the Justicialista, the Peronist, the Civic Radicals, which would be center left slightly, and the Frente for the Victoria Kirchner's, President Kirchner and Cristina Kirchner's party, blocked all three of them at different times, but always any bill favoring the factories from becoming law. Paul O'Neill, the high-ranking IMF official, went to Argentina, and he told basically Congress and the government that if they continued blocking these bills, they would receive an additional $13 million in credit that they had requested. So eventually factory workers got onto the idea that perhaps the government didn't really represent the country and the citizenry, but really the interests of the IMF. And there was I had lots of interviews, I can read some of them if you want during our discussion, that show that this is really the first time workers are starting to sniff something about these connections that normally go unnoticed by most sectors of the population. Leftist parties also invisibilized, but in a very perverse and different way, the factories. Some of these leftist parties, they claim that these factories were poised to lead the national struggle, here's a quote, against the owners of capital and state, and that they described these factories as bourgeois cooperatives, and they called for their nationalization. The claim was that these factories were really almost like the new Leninist vanguard of the working class. It's really quite diluted. But it had a very functional influence in that what happened because of that, the editors of Buenos Aires' most prestigious and conservative newspaper, La Nación, started invoking Manichaean and anachronistic notions from the recent past, portraying workers as occupiers, this is a quote, usurpers, another quote, and factories, and here's a quote, as Soviets, a menace to the constitutional order. Here's a typical editorial. I read, the occupation and control of these factories by workers is a violation of property rights and annuls a central precept enshrined in our Constitution. The right of workers to make demands on their employees and on our government must never be allowed to prevail over the rights to private property. Now, some of these terms and phrases really are mnemonic devices. They remind readers that the last time that workers had taken over factories, it had provoked a military dictatorship, which led to the disappearance of 30,000 citizens. Now, for me, globalization is a variant. I mean, if there's military disappearances, to me, globalization is a form of disappearance. Again, the idea that what are the mechanisms that are used to disappear people changes over time. but the purpose is more or less the same. La Nación's coverage of the factories was in fact so biased and misleading that an alternative news service in Buenos Aires called La Vaca, staffed by professional journalists, brought formal charges against La Nación and other newspapers in the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And they were getting denounced, and in fact they had to retract some of the editorials. Many of La Nación's readers in Buenos Aires began to use what Albert Hirschman once called a reactionary rhetoric in talk shows and public forums where the factories were discussed. As a climate of opinion was created, was generated, and to speak of the climate of opinion is very difficult to pin down. I mean, how do you pin down a climate? We don't have a thermometer. So, but what you did have was the fact that judges all of a sudden felt that there was enough support to start routinely sending anti-riot units to retake the factories from the workers. This happened quite frequently in 2002. This was like the peak year when you had a real counteroffensive against the factories. So much so that a member of the Supreme Court, Raúl Zaffaroni, intervened and made several public declarations saying, well, you know, I'm not for or against the factories, but what I can say as a constitutional lawyer and jurist and very distinguished, member of the Supreme Court, is that workers do have the right to protest. That's in our Constitution, and nobody can violate that. So again, through public opinion, through the press, through the public sphere, all of these converged in a sense, and what they created was this disappearance of the factory workers. All of a sudden, they weren't anywhere. All the institutions in democratic life that are supposed to assist vulnerable marginal groups are no longer playing that role. Part 3, let me very quickly go through some of the communitarian practices. This is the communitarian bit of the communitarian communitarian cosmopolitanism that I'm speaking of. First, inside the factories. By the way, it's very important. When I speak of these factories, there have been some very good, excellent studies, far better than what I could ever do, on these factories as worker control. And I think it's very valuable. I'm really interested in a slightly different issue, which is citizenship. And therefore, I don't get into too much this issue of worker control. That's not what my primary concern is. Workers, one of the things that they did is, because they were juridically in limbo, they didn't have a status, they needed credit to restart the factory. So what they did is that they started, if you will, a kind of Maussian form, Marcel Mauss, you know, the anthropologist, gift giving. But it was an unusual arrangement. If a factory lent you money, you didn't return the money to the factory that lent you money. Rather, you lent the money to the next factory that's opening up. So it created a moral economic chain from one factory to the next. And the default was really very, very small. And what this did is it prepared the ground for the creation of these networks that came up on the screen, these two networks. This money was used to pay off electrical bills that the owner had left unpaid, to buy raw materials, and so on and so forth. The meaning of labor and work in the factory was transformed. Because they were so engaged in political activism, a discussion broke out in some of the factories, and eventually all the factories discussed it, is whether protests should be constituted as part of productive labor or not. So there were debates about what is productivity, what is work, what is labor, the meaning of how much remuneration should we get the same? Should we get 3/4 salary if we go on protest? Should it be full salary? These kinds of discussions are taking place all over the place. Another discussion was the salary structure. All these factories are egalitarian in their salary. From the cleaning person to the account, everybody makes the same. Issues of self-management, again, this is the common pattern. There's a two-tier system of governance inside the factories with an administrative wing an executive wing and a legislative wing. The executive implements the decisions, the legislative, it's not unlike any kind of political system. Legislative proposes things and discusses them and debates. There's also it's not quite a judicial wing, but there is also a system of penalty if a worker violates the common agreements of the factory. Let me give you some examples of the way these factories now try. So we're moving from inside the factory to outside the factory. How they try to repair the social fabric of community life. This is part of this program to regain worldliness, which is the way I started off the presentation. Dozens of factories started adult education programs on their premises for the children, not necessarily of the workers, children in the community, many of them who had dropped out of school. IMPA, the metallurgical plant, has the largest of them, very successful, and they would teach, their thinking is that what they wanted to do was to train a new generation of what Gramsci would call organic intellectuals. So they would teach courses like, and here's a title, and I read the textbook, History of Popular and Community Struggles in Argentina. In fact, some of these textbooks, which I'll allude to later on, were printed in Venezuela. There was a deal struck between some of these factories and Venezuela. Yaguané, the meat plant, the slaughterhouse, has a library which it's for tutoring kids. It also runs a public soup kitchen for people in the neighborhood. We're talking about a very, very, very poor community. It's just the level of necessity it defies the imagination. They would, from their weekly butchering, they would set aside cheap cuts and they would provide these soup kitchens, communal kitchens. In the town of Saavedra, there are no slides available. There's a textile beatway, it's called, and they signed an agreement with a medium security penitentiary so that the prisoners who were going to be released, had completed most of their sentences, could be reintegrated into the community. They were trained to be, they were trained in the factory, and they were given access to raw materials and also machinery. And by the end of the year, they were producing roughly 25,000 sneakers and 1,600 jogging pants. But more importantly, they had skills now. So it presumably made it easier for them to become reintegrated. Again, the idea is that factories would play a role. Given that the normal institutions of democracy were not delivering, factories would now become the institutions that would incorporate these invisibilized, marginalized workers. The Bowen, which I did show, provides families from the provinces who must travel to Buenos Aires either because of a medical problem, they need high-tech medicine for a family member, or legal, whatever kind of problem, they can stay at the Bowen for a discounted price, very significant discounted price. Chilaver, the graphics, it runs a center for information. It's stocked with CDs, secondary sources, journal articles, academic thesis, so on and so forth. And the point here is to ensure that factory workers, in this transition from lived experience to historical memory, there's going to be an alternative account of what the factories are about. I mean, there's a self-reflexivity that what often happens is it's very difficult to study these movements because, in fact, the sources are so completely distorted that the voices of those who participated in these events can no longer represent themselves. Let me now move on from, so we've gone from the factory to civil society. Let me now move on how it was that citizenship was enacted in political society. They entered political society in order to, and they did this through various routes, okay? We have street marches, both direct, participatory. In the US, there's a big debate right now whether, democracy should be participatory, representative, isn't and people seem to think it's important to take sides. I'm opportunistic. Whatever works, works. And I think one should use both all the time. So they engage both in participatory as well as representative forms of democracy. For example, court hearings, elections, and they did this both in political society as well as in the transnational domain. In political society, one of the first, as you know, public opinion matters, the press matters. So basically, the businessmen relied on La Nación to put forward their point of view, and La Nación was very effective in persuading its readership that factories were a menace, like I said. They also had, as businessmen do, they have professional gatherings, trade fairs, cocktail parties, working lunches, etc. And what they would do is that they would always tell each other, don't do business with the factories. They're unreliable, they're corrupt, you're going to go bankrupt. I have a very juicy quote. I'll read it because it's really worth reading. This is an interview with the main purveyor to the Bowen. This particular firm, it's called Mayorista.com. It's also the main purveyor to all the Hilton hotels in Argentina. And this is an executive talking. Each time the Bowen makes headlines because of a street march or because the judge has threatened them with eviction, my boss would get exceedingly tense. He would summon me into his office and ask me about their account. I would also get calls from other clients and colleagues. They advised me to stop doing business with the Bowen and that its staff was incompetent and dishonest and that I would sooner or later lose money. In our line of business, you know, everyone knows each other and we always take care of our own. Again, the whole point, a lot of this gets established informally. It's underneath the radar screen. You can't detect it. But these are these informal networks that operate really, again, the whole point to invisibilize. Factory workers had to become visible. So what did they do? Again, in political society, they engage in street marches and demonstrations. There were two types, and I won't go through the details, but Yaguané, which is in the countryside, deep in the countryside where politics is played really rough. Basically, what they would do all the time is that they would surround municipal courts and just stack big tires, set them ablaze, and just smoke the judges and their staff out of the courtroom. And this was their way of letting them know that the way they were deciding these things was unacceptable. In the city, where this is to reproduce barbarism and civilization. In the city where things are more civilized, the Bowen would stage, like I said, they would engage in these street theaters and they would put beds and night tables and couches and the whole thing. They would reproduce an imaginary room in a hotel and they would invite pedestrians to join them. They would serve them tea. They would have waiters, with the little things and, the trays and the whole thing. And they would then just try and explain to them what the problem was. And of course, this was covered by the press. These are dramatic events. And this is the way they started gradually becoming visible again. Again, in political domain, there were other strategies they used. Lobbying was very important. They would spend weeks at a time camping out in the municipal city hall. And they would just do old-fashioned lobby. They would go there, they would, as they say, schmooze with these people, and then they would organize these big barbecues, these asados in the factories. They would bring them over, and they had a grand old time, and before they knew them, the workers were just, these politicians were eating out of their hands. But the problem remained, and this is like the big contradiction, if you will, for a lot of these movements, is that this is the problem of what happens. Lobbying requires time, so does demonstration, and you can't be producing, you can't be in a factory producing, being productive, just getting the work done, and being engaged in politics all the time, because something has to give. And this is the problem of free rider, as you know. So the factories face this dilemma, whether to engage in collective solidarity and continue practicing politics in this way, or risk falling into bankruptcy. So they came up with a very clever device, which is, believe it or not, also a very formal legal device, which is called the class action suit. If you bring together all the factories, you don't have to do it one at a time. So this is what they did. They brought together the factories and they pressed. But then the question became, what are they going to press for? What are they going to demand? So the demand that they pressed for is that the factories were a common good. That's a legal category in Argentina. Here in the US, the equivalent would be eminent domain. So the factories are not really, strictly speaking, private property. The factories are part of a common good that belongs to the community. Once they go bankrupt, they no longer are, strictly speaking, they're in a limbo. There's a moment when, and it's only during that moment that this works. They're no longer private property, but they've not been bought by anybody else. So there's a moment when they can make the argument that they're eminent domain, and this is what they did. The other, I won't go through the cases, they're very technical, very complex, but we can discuss them. The other thing they did is that they entered the electoral field. Here, Lula's party in Brazil became, in a sense, an inspiration to, not only in Argentina, but in other places. The idea was to try and create a workers' party in Argentina. And so what they did is that they put forward a slate of 10 candidates. 2 of them won. Diego Cravez was elected to serve in the city of Buenos Aires legislature. And his politics was very interesting because, in fact, what he tried to use during his campaign, this is a completely unknown candidate, except for the people in the factory. So the question is, how do you reach, how does somebody who's known in the factory but not known among the electorate, how do you make the crossover, no? And so he started attending rallies and so on and so forth. But he started talking about the factories. The term is laburantes, which is, it's a term in Argentina that has enormous resonance. I don't know if there's a term here that would have, I don't know, it's like something when, maybe Martin Luther King or civil rights. I mean, some term that all of a sudden in the US, it really jolts the mind. Well, laburantes in Argentina is a term I had never heard. I mean, I had heard, but I didn't know where it came from. And I was surprised at the resonance it had. It turns out that laburantes is a term that was used mostly by immigrants to refer to each other. There's a kind of a moral economy dimension of it. These are like honest, skilled, upright workers who, many of the people listening to this language of laburantes are actually the children of these people. They're the grandfathers of many of the people who are currently living in Buenos Aires. And so Cravez kind of used the language of family, the idiom of kinship, in order to create an alliance between the factory workers and the citizenry. Again, this has nothing to do with, human rights. It has nothing to do with sophisticated NGO, transparency, accountability. Everything we're always reading about. This has nothing to do with Kant and cosmopolitanism. This is just old-fashioned idioms. I suppose I should let the cat out of the bag. I actually think Marxism as a language has impoverished the radical imagination because it's prevented groups locally to use the local idioms of radicalism to transform democratic forms of life locally. This kind of Marxism has become an Esperanto language which is empty of local significance. And I think it's important to bring it once again and creolize the local idiom of radicalism. I'll put the cat back in the box. The other person that won was in this election was Francisco Gutierrez. He's an old-time militant. He was disappeared for 6 years. This guy has an amazing history. He quit the union, the metallurgical unions, to become a leader of the Recuperated factories, and he's won every single election that he's ever run for. He linked up with a parish in Quilmes, which is a dirt poor parish, and they used their soup kitchens, their drug addiction centers. I mean, they just mobilized all the institutions of this parish in support of Gutierrez, and he's won mayorship, he won the senatorship of, he just, every time he goes, everybody knows he's gonna win. President Kirchner and Cristina Kirchner are actually opposed to him. And if you want, we can talk a little bit about Frente para la Victoria. So the factory workers were successful in transforming the idiom and practice of communitarianism from inside the factory and civil society into the arenas of political society. Like I said, the courts, elections, and so on. Let's quickly go through the transnational domain. Here, basically, the factories established ties with the European Union, mostly through Bologna, the Red Belt of Italy. They have very progressive unions there, and Italy, for many years, as you know, experimented with an alternative model to Fordist production, which is called flexible specialization. It's based almost on highly, highly specialized forms, kind of like boutique production. Something, you create something that's so specialized, you occupy that niche, and it's very difficult for anybody to compete against you. In Buenos Aires, they called it Gaucho Production. Again, this business of translating other experiences into local idiom. And they created backward and forward linkages, for those of you who are economists. Among factories, they created networks of factories so that they would cooperate, collaborate with each other. It's very successful to this day. They did industrial branding. They do what all postmodern neoliberal production do, you know, what is it? The logo, the whole thing, the creating customer loyalty, using all sorts of fancy things. They also established ties with ALBA. This is the Venezuelan President Chavez's. They went to several congresses and they signed 75 commercial contracts and promissory notes with enterprises from all over Latin America. Some of them quite, you know, we're talking about millions of dollars. The largest shipbuilding plant in Buenos Aires is now creating ships for Venezuelan Petroleum Company. The textbooks I talked about, Venezuela has ordered textbooks from this printing plant in Buenos Aires. Let me close the discussion. So that's the transnational bit. And again, I can give you more detailed information. And this is the part that, as he takes water and swallows, this is the part where Arendt's gloomy vision of what she called the crisis of our century. She claimed that totalitarianism had finished. When she penned these remarks, already Nazism had vanished and Stalinism, Stalin lay basically on his deathbed. But this is her observation, which I came across it and I found it riveting. It just dislocated my head when I read it. She says, "It is true that the elements of totalitarianism can be found by retracing the history of pariah peoples and analyzing the political implications of what we usually call the crisis of our century. Then the conclusion is unavoidable that it will no more disappear with the death of Stalin than it disappeared with the fall of Nazi Germany. It may even be the case that the true phenomena of our times, totalitarianism, will assume its most authentic form, though not necessarily its cruelest, only when totalitarianism has become a thing of the past." I mean, the point to her observations, as I understand them, is that as a regime, totalitarianism can become, if you will, it doesn't need to be savage. It can be, if you will, quite humane. It can use diffuse techniques from media, kind of collective idiocy, and transform people in ways that will no longer have to act and think as citizens. If the whole point of totalitarianism is to strip citizens of their rights, this perhaps as a long-term proposition is much more effective than having to use this kind of savagery that was used under Nazism and Stalinism. I would claim that Argentina's crisis of the century didn't begin with the military dictatorship. That's really a thing of the past. That's kind of an old-fashioned form. I think it really began with neoliberalism. My claim is that Arendt's point which again is quite controversial among specialists of Arendt. I've run this by some of my colleagues, and they kind of wince, and they say, well, you have to read, that footnote and then that footnote. And so my sense is that, she has a hierarchical ordering of rights: human rights, civic rights, and political rights. My claim is that her understanding of rights, I think, is really based, it's textually supported. This is not just speculation. Her understanding of rights, is my claim, is really based on mutual recognition. She has it's not, when she speaks of rights, it's not a legal doctrine, and it's not centered on the state, which is really how most Arendtians construe rights. My claim is that in the Arendtian account, rights are really embedded in community life. That's what gives you recognition, and that it's not, as is now often we hear from scholars, it's not the basis of cosmopolitanism, which is the claim that everybody makes. Listen to this quote. The rights to have rights she defined as the right to belong to some kind of organized community. So in order to have rights, you really have to be embedded in a community. You can't just be a free-floating cosmopolitan. You have to be recognized by somebody. And this somebody is the only one who can actually protect and help you preserve your rights. Now, if this argument is right, this presents other problems with Arendt's argument. And the main problem that it presents, it's a kind of circular thinking. In order to participate in politics, one first must be recognized as a speaking animal. And she uses the term speaking animal just simply as citizen. Think as somebody who's understandable and recognized in their community. Someone who has been liberated from the necessities of life. She always has this dichotomy between the animal laborans and the working person who's subjected to needs and therefore can't participate in politics, and those who have been liberated from needs and can engage in great deeds and great action. What she does is she naturalizes this dichotomy in the demos. So in a sense, the only people who have rights are those who, to begin with, already have these rights. So in a sense, her formulation doesn't enable her to get out of this circular reasoning. I came late upon some of Rancier's insights, but now that I'm starting to vigorously incorporate him, I think he has perhaps a much more convincing, compelling account, and this is the way it can be, Arendt's argument can be reformulated. Groups, according to Rancier, rights-bearing citizens in the Arendtian tradition are only those groups who supposedly are capable of engaging in speech and action. Conversely, politics typically involves a struggle by subaltern groups to be seen and heard as speaking subjects within a social order. Or no, I got this, sorry. In order to participate, wait, where is it? I lost it. Yeah, Rancier's claim is that, here it is, that political exclusion occurs in democratic regimes when rights-bearing citizens construe and represent other groups as incapable of engaging in meaningful speech and action, which is Arendt's argument. Conversely, and this is again Rancier's point, politics typically involves a struggle through which and by which subaltern groups can be seen and heard as speaking subjects within a social order that denies them the qualifications to participate in politics. My claim is that I think his vision of politics, at least for making sense of these groups that have been invisibilized and are trying to regain their citizenship, is probably more interesting and more productive than Arendt's at this point. But like I said, I came late to this argument, and that's why it's also late in the paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Just to start a discussion, let me just start. I think that Carlos has put on the table both a fascinating case study that commends attention for what political choices are available in the current globalized order, and also then how to conceptualize the action that's being described. And I guess there are three takeaway points that I have that I'd like to raise for consideration. The first is kind of draws from the overall theme of what lesson is Carlos drawing, what lesson can we draw from these recuperated factory movement. It seems to me that I'm struck at once by the liberatory, impressive quality of this movement, breaking out of the conventional choices and how the limiting possibilities that seem to have affected contemporary politics more generally. I mean, this is a really exceptional kind of set of activities that break out of the table of contents that we're used to dealing with. At the same time, I have to ask, why isn't this, I mean, is this I guess the related question is, can this be translated to other places and moments? And why is it difficult to do that? And I guess what I'm struck by is, but the second point is that this activity seems to be rooted in two kinds of action, two kind of traditions, political traditions. One, it's despite the fact that it's a radical set of actions, it seems from the talk to be rooted in a very specific constitutionalist and legal order. That is, it matters that these workers are able to, and they do, exploit and adapt aspects of Argentine law, even in the very new law, which, as you call it, that gave birth to this neoliberal order, this free market legal system in which all talk was talk of property rights. Even within that order, there were aspects of the new law that provided some room to maneuver, which was crucial to the recuperated factory movement. In particular, you refer to the fact that, in some sense, the state held these factories in trust, or the agents to which were given the factories held them in trust, and there was what the state called a permanent guard that was placed over them, and that included a certain limitation on what could be done during a period of transition. And it was that limitation, including the fact that you weren't supposed to move plant, you weren't supposed to deprive the factory of its crucial machinery, that the workers seized on as violations of the law. So the workers themselves were appealing not to overturn the system, and I think Carlos brings this out when he was talking about why, I mean, I think this is part of why Carlos is saying this is outside of just a resort to a doctrine of human rights or even of internationalist, class consciousness. This is not an appeal to just the right of revolution. This is not an appeal to the right of revolution. Rather, these actions, at least from the workers' own, they are seeking legitimacy from within a very nationalistic frame, from a very constitutionalist frame of reference. Now, the other point you made, Carlos makes secondly, is that there also, in which I don't think is you're able to draw out as much in the talk, is aside from this constitutionalist and legal order, these actions are drawing on what you call local idioms. the laborantes theme. And that also suggests, I guess that would be another angle to discuss. What are the sources of this popular culture? But I'm, from a more American point of view, I'm struck by the comparison, the parallel between this whole set of actions in Argentina with one of the most intriguing incidents in the US since the Great Recession began. And that is something that most of you would have some awareness of, namely the Republic Windows and Doors case here in Chicago in 2008. Remember, that was the single factory which was making a very small case, but it's remarkably to me like this factory takeovers in Argentina. There's this Republic Windows and Doors plant in Chicago that was, it went bankrupt, and the company was moving to shut the plant down, and the workers occupied the factory. It was a plant that was organized by this very small radical union, the United Electrical Workers, the UE, kind of outside of the main AFL-CIO framework. But instead of just protesting, the workers actually sat down in the factory. And people have, and ultimately they forced a resolution of the case. And the fact that they're still, it's still in production. But people for the moment, when that happened in 2008, people thought, well, maybe this is the way American workers can respond to the decline of, in this period of attacks on workers more generally. But that hasn't been the case. Why not? And in fact, the Republic Windows and Doors case also depended on a very specific interpretation of law and legitimacy. It was not even as radical as the UE. The UE is an old communist-led union and still has a lot of radical leadership and instinct about it. Nevertheless, the UE was depending on the fact that the company, Republic Windows and Doors, was in hoc to the banks, the Bank of America and Morgan Chase, at the very time when the Bank of America and Morgan Chase were under intense scrutiny because of the TARP funds that they had taken on. And they were under such scrutiny that the fact that the company had started to move out equipment actually violated a law called the Warren Act, in which companies which are going bankrupt have to give workers 60-day notice. They hadn't done it. They were, in short, legally, as the union pressed the point, they owed the union millions of dollars for violation of law. It was on that basis that the UE and the Republic Windows and Doors case was able to withstand legal and governmental pressure to maintain their sit-down. In both cases, in short, Argentina and Republic Windows and Doors, this radical, uncommon set of worker action was carefully tied to a constitutionalist idiom. And that shows both the strength and alas, the limitations, as far as I can see, of this kind of activity. In the case of Argentina, the other, I guess the other point that I would raise is, what I think is fascinating, is the challenge that comes with worker self-government within an order which has not been toppled. So you have this kind of unevenness between a regime which is still generally going along with, the global world order, the globalization and a kind of market-oriented world order, and this pockets of resistance in the case of these factories. It's a little like the disjuncture, this has occurred in American history, when cooperatives, moments of cooperatives, worker-owned enterprises have tried to withstand or compete or challenge more corporate forms of organization. We saw that under the movement of populism in the era of the Knights of Labor. We've seen that occasionally ever since. And it's always been at once exhilarating, but also challenging, and ultimately, usually difficult to sustain these individual enterprise efforts within a larger order. In this case, as you point out, they had the challenge of could they compete at any level with the private marketplace? How would they divide up whatever surplus they had? How would they maintain their connection to community connections with their own need to maintain some solvency? I think the most dramatic case that you mentioned, to me, and most remarkable one, is their ability, willingness, effort to enter into some kind of cooperation even with nearby prison labor. Because in this country, there's been, I would say, no bigger contrast or conflict than workers inside and outside prison walls. In the sense that prison labor has been used only to undermine workers, in the so-called free marketplace. And as a result, and workers and unions have had if anything, always tried to limit the work that prisoners do rather than offer them any access to the world of the marketplace, for fear that those prison labor is competing and undermining them. So I thought of all the individual examples that you raised in this other remarkable set of social experiments. That was probably the most radical and most imaginative of all the efforts. And I'm just wondering how, I'd love to know more about it. So I put a couple of questions on the table, but maybe others could, before you respond, we could see who else would like to raise comments or questions. Amaya?
Thank you for your talk. It was really interesting and powerful. I wanted to see if, when you looked at the broader kind of social movements, when you look at Argentina, it was very interesting to me when you talk about the piqueteros and the comparison, because both with the piqueteros and also with the unemployed public workers who had been released, when you read about those struggles, there's also a lot of mention of dignity, of the loss of dignity, and these workers that you're talking about in terms of like they would lose dignity. And then you talk about this term, the laborantes, as a kind of upstanding person who, which counters that notion of somebody who's lost their dignity. So I was wondering if you could comment more broadly as you make this connection between the workers and the civil society, and sort of there are sort of these new kind of ways of, and you talked about the political imagination in which people and different kinds of workers and unemployed people are thinking about themselves in this new, neoliberal regime.
Yes.
There have been some scholars that have looked at all of these little events going on, popular subjects, they're being called, the people that are involved, and interstitials within the legal system, and that there might be a chiseling away at the system, even though that they're working within the system in terms of the legal, but they're finding these little spaces for action, and that eventually will bring out real change, that you don't have to have a revolution as we have known it to be via the Marxian language, but that these little spaces and these actions will eventually bring about real change. Is that something that you would argue too, that there's all of these rather small actions, 22,000 workers, can then eventually bring about what we would say is real change within society?
Yeah.
Hey, Carlos. What I was wondering, if you want to talk a little bit, going back to Arendt, because I think for her, it's not, civic engagement really is a means to an end, which is freedom, right? That's what provides, in a certain sense, so maybe tying in this idea of dignity and freedom. And I read her also not to have these very strict divisions, right? I mean, she's got the hierarchy of rights, but engagement can occur in lots of different places, right? And so I was curious about the way that you're kind of demarcating political versus civic. Here we've been talking a little bit about civilizing the political and politicizing the civic, and how porous that is, given all these various legality spaces within which you can both engage civically and engage politically and make certain reconfiguration of changes, or spaces that then allow for, if you will, that dignity to then be able to be recaptured in instances, right? So I was curious about how you made those distinctions.
Yeah, Michael.
I'd like to ask a very practical kind of question. Is this still going on now? And when did it begin? What precipitated it? I don't have a sort of sense of location and time of all this.
Okay.
Very simple question.
Good. Well, maybe, did you want to? Okay. Oh, that's a good set of entrees. So take your pick.
Let me maybe work backwards. It began, the first wave, it occurred almost in waves, but the first wave where you could really discern that something was going on was the year 2000. Economists who have studied the history of firms in Argentina have determined that if you survive for more than 10 years, and this probably varies from one country to another, but in the Argentine case, if you have a firm, an enterprise that survives more than 10 years, in all likelihood, that's really where most of the failures, what Schumpeter would call creative destruction, that's really where it takes place. But if you cross the threshold, then you're more or less, you're not guaranteed, but the likelihood of success increases dramatically. Most of these firms have now crossed the threshold. They're roughly, I didn't make it part of the talk, but let me, I think it is significant to say this. So there's, right now, there are approximately, I think it's 5,000 shuttered factories in the country. And the bet is that not all of them, but that some of them will try and see if possibly they can get restarted. Most of the factories were, the heyday, I would say like maybe 90% of them came to, their genesis was in between 2000 and 2005. And then from then on, there was a trickle. And now it's starting to pick up again. But I mean, I feel like I'm on solid grounds regarding the early part. The later part, I can't say. Most of them are concentrated in the greater metropolitan area, although there are some of the most dramatic ones are actually outside Sanon, which is a ceramics tile factory. In a way, it breaks out of this pattern that I'm studying, because that one really was. It really has a very strong Trotskyist presence. So I'm really interested in these factories that were started really basically by mom and pops, grandmothers and grandfathers, people who didn't have any kind of, they weren't militants, they had no strong history of labor activism or party partisanship and any of this. These are just people who said, well, if we don't do this, we won't have a place in the world. And this is where we make our stand. And now these factories, I think it's important to underscore, they're different. I mean, in the 40s, there was a wave of factory takeovers by the workers. But these are different, and that's what I keep trying to persuade my colleagues, is that in the 40s, when it was factory takeovers were used as a union strategy to force management or capital in order to get some gains. I mean, remember, there's no owners to these factories. So this, and there's also, this is not part of a union strategy. So there's something distinctive new. I'm interested in the new beginnings. No, I'm not interested in tracing everything to origins. I'm interested in at what point does the present disengage from the past. And this is what I think, this is a moment of newness that's occurring. So it has both the conjunctural bit, which has to do with the 2000 crisis, but it has to be understood in a longer frame of that this really does break from past patterns of takeovers. Some people are trying to simply say this is simply an extension of what happened before, and I'm trying to say this is not an extension. There's a rupture here. There's a new modality that needs to be understood in new terms. Yeah. Arendt and you're right. You're absolutely right. I mean, Arendt's main concern was freedom. And the way you framed it, I thought was really very powerful. How do you politicize the civic and civicize, if there is such a term, the political and these spaces. This is all true, but I have an intuition that also she had a rather narrow understanding of exactly what politics was and where it could be practiced and what kinds of issues could be political and what kinds of issues could not be political. I think her agenda and you know, her essays against what she calls housekeeping, which we would today call welfare state, she thought it was not acceptable, because anything that had to do with needs she thought was a degradation of politics, that because politics was focused on freedom, you could never talk about needs. And I think what I'm trying to suggest here is that needs can be an act of freedom, that you can transform, that you're freest when you recognize necessity, and when you recognize your necessity, you're also freest. And so I'm trying to see if we can twist a little bit some of her arguments. And I do think that, at least in the way, in the circles that I travel, she's always, her conception of rights seems to be quite embedded. There is this hierarchy of rights, but in the end, everybody says that these rights have to do with the state. I mean, they seem to anchor rights in this, and hence, when in the war, when these the emigres, the exiles, the pariah people were left stateless, nobody picked them up, because, and it's always the state who gives or who concedes, or else doesn't recognize rights. And what I'm trying to suggest perhaps is that there's both a horizontal understanding of citizenship which is embedded in mutual recognition. And then, yes, admittedly, there's also a vertical which is rooted in the state. But that to claim that Arendt was only interested in the vertical axis, I think is leaving out a very important argument. And I don't quite understand either why, in the argument today, people are spatializing rights as if the only rights we're interested in are human rights. All of a sudden, we've forgotten all these other rights. And I think we shouldn't, I mean, I'm all in favor of human rights, but we shouldn't forget the other ones. The business about the little spaces and the fissures and the breaches, and can we it's you know, I don't, partly because of the way I understand politics, I don't think it's a question of spaces or size or big or small. I think, again, I understand politics as the way society imagines itself, and unless, whether the size is big or small, to me the payoff is, does it restructure the symbolic? And this can be big or small. I'm agnostic. Sometimes it's big, sometimes it's small. But what I would like to see is, can it enable us to construe life slightly differently. Because I do think the imaginary, I'm perhaps, I think society requires, because society is differentiated, division of labor creates a lot of fissures, and I think society, even when you, to understand your shared differences, you have to have a common set of terms. Even when you fight with an enemy, you need to know what you're fighting about, and I think that's what politics does. It provides you with a common set of reference, and this, I think, can be small or large. I can imagine both types. On the piqueteros and the laburantes, let me before that discussion, let me backtrack a little bit. I don't want to give the impression that that neoliberalism, and I'll give you a very paradoxical example, that neoliberalism always necessarily produces this kind of solidarity. For example, the urban scavengers, which I've made a few incursions, cirujas they're called in Buenos Aires, the ones who at night, the city at night becomes like a medieval city. All of a sudden, people come out with, their children, just tons of children with their families. They roam the city with these big, huge carts, picking up papers and cardboard and glass and all of this. And I was telling Jorge Alberto, I started going with them, but it was winter and it's too rugged for me. I couldn't sustain the nights because this is done at night, so I decided to shift and go to the factories. It's warmer. So these to show you how much these scavengers have already incorporated neoliberal sensibilities, they actually are incredibly individualistic, and they refuse to create any kinds of collective. I mean, there's actually one important collective, but by and large, these urban scavengers are absolutely rigorously individualistic, and they abhor any kind of collective action. They actually have staked out the city. They've divided the city by zone, and no scavenger would dare poach on another area, because that produces warfare. And then when that happens, and it has happened several times, it gets very ugly. So I want to perhaps introduce this because I think it's important to understand that many of the people who have been marginalized have actually assimilated without them quite knowing so. As in England, when they talked about possessive individualists, they actually are already neoliberal subjects without quite knowing so, although in their daily lives and practices, they've actually been, in many ways, damaged by the policies of neoliberalism. But this then leads me to this distinction of the piqueteros and the laburantes, which is that in Argentina, if there's such a thing as a moral, ethical hierarchy among the working class, the piqueteros are relatively low on that hierarchy because they're seen as, but again, we would need to make distinctions because within the piqueteros they're fractions, and they're, the old saying, you get 3 Argentines together and you get 8 factions. Everybody has a different group. And so, by and large, the piqueteros are thought of as being dependent on the state. And there's a moral stigma attached to that. They're thought of as being opportunistic. They're part of the old puntero tradition of handing out goods for support of the government. Except there's one faction that actually is very defiant. And then when you talk about them, they're always excluded from this moral evaluation. There's a lot of moral discussions going on among the working class, which again is we simply oftentimes forget that they're ethical subjects like anybody else, and they're trying to figure out the world in ethical terms. The issue of where do I have all this paper? Here we go. The issue of prisons actually leads me to a counterintuitive point, which is, but it rolls off your commentary, which is carceral societies. I mean, U.S. right now is, my understanding is, it's one of the, if not the leading carceral society. This is, I think, what Hannah Arendt is also talking about when she talks about neo-totalitarianism. You don't need, you have television, you have prisons, you have goods, and you release them to the population, and you basically you either stupefy them or you render them passive. I think this would be additional evidence, perhaps, in support of this neo-totalitarianist forms of life that are emerging. Perhaps the difference with the U.S. is because the U.S. really has a very huge carceral society. If you were to bring them, incorporate them into the market, they would destroy the labor market. I think in Argentina, because the prison population is much smaller, perhaps they can be incorporated, and especially in the countryside, and they wouldn't have the same kind of impact. So this is a straight demographic problem. The issue of the idioms, the different I was absolutely fascinated. If I had known, I mean, I'd go visit the what is it, Works, Republic Works indoors. Which idioms does one use? Are they translatable? Like Occupy Wall Street, for example. That, at least in New York, it really did have a huge impact. The new school was very involved in that. We have, on the one hand, we have Occupy Wall Street. On the other hand, in the US, we have the Tea Party. And there are different idioms in a sense. I mean, the Tea Party is probably the only popular movement of any country that's been hit by a crisis that's actually been in support of privatization and the slashing of public spending. I mean, most European countries that have been hit by this, the response has been more or less a protest. Now, the Occupy Wall Street is the first time that this issue of inequality became once again part of a public agenda after maybe decades where issues of inequality had been silenced. But it was all done I think in a very local idiom. There was not talk about what was the old term, monopoly capitalism. People just say, we are the, 99%, 90%? And it was a US idiom. It was something that had really local flavor to it. And also the Tea Party, in a sense, the Tea Party and the Occupy, they converge in their analysis that the US state serves corporate America. They're right. I mean, the conclusions they derive from that are very opposite. But it's a local, I think, language that they're trying to use to reach a population. Like in France also, I have a colleague who's studying human rights, and she was saying the reason immigrants go to France, especially immigrants who have some kind of deadly disease like AIDS or something like that, and they go to France and they get asylum because they say, if they stay in their country, you're in fact condemning us to death because we won't have access to retroviral drugs. So they use the language of human rights in France because of French republicanism is a very dominant language. So they're able to use the language to, in their own terms, persuade that they should be given asylum at a time when asylum is not easy to get in France. So again, I'm very intrigued by how it is that you use the narrative resources of a society to reach those who are your compatriots, because in the end, these are the people that you need to persuade. And in the case of, I don't think it's translatable. I think these are moments where a society is forced to rethink itself. And I think these are unpredictable. This is the thing. I think these social science works under the premise that you can establish laws or patterns or causality, and I think that's the thing about politics. I think politics is a surprise. I think politics is completely unconditioned. It's a miracle, a human miracle. And this is related, of course, to the what you raised about the constitutional legal language of the times. And I had never taken the Constitution seriously, quite frankly. I had never really given much thought to any legal doctrine of any kind. And it was only because I started hearing it on the street from these workers that I said, what's going on here? You know, at the universities, I used to think the only people who talked about legal doctrine were my reactionary colleagues, and now I'm hearing this from, you know, how can this be? And then this forced me to reconsider, and I started reading up on this, and again, this for me was a very enlightening experience. I had to like retrain myself, and then I became persuaded that law is in a way no different. It's a register that's really no different from any other language, and it's part of the symbolic landscape. It's just that I had never been taught law yet to think about law in these terms. But once I was able to make the switch, I said, well, fine. So this is no different than any other idiom.
Can I ask a question? What if the idiom has like certain kinds of gendered resonances, and are there implications that draw from that?
Absolutely, absolutely.
You know, one of the things that my undergrad students have been in here for a lit class, and I had them watch the tape last week as kind of context for this talk. And you know, one of the it's a class all full of women, and one of the things that they noticed was the kind of narrative of pathos about the indignity of an unemployed man, right? Of a man who's unable to provide for his family. And well, you know, they were kind of going back and forth because some of them recognized, well, it didn't seem to preclude the participation of women workers, like with the Brookman factory. But even the imagery, and of course the documentary and the representation is very distinct from the movement, but even in the documentary there's a kind of romance of the masculinism of industrial labor, right? Like those really strong, beautiful images as the machinery is going back into, right? Like production, and you have all these male workers, and the sparks are flying as the forge, you know. So, I mean, it's interesting because you're talking about the usefulness and the importance of these nuanced, localized idioms, but it seems like sometimes what resonates are going to have these, you know, what it's carrying over are other kinds of categories, social categories and hierarchies.
Yeah. You know, in the factories they use a phrase which has nothing to do with the US term, but they use, and I'll explain why, but they use a phrase negrito, blackie. And blackie is a phrase, it came from when the immigrants during industrialization, they came to the city, and they all have their swarthy skin, and they have very jet black hair. And when they arrived in the city, which was more European, fair skin, etc., then they were called negritos. And now factory workers, and so negrito also became a term of stigmatization for dumb, lazy, incompetent, uneducated, uncouth, etc. And in the factory, and I heard this myself a number of times, they would, for example, if there was a worker who would leave his tools around the machine lying around without cleaning his area, or if they would come a little tipsy, as some of them did to work, they're saying, you're still eres un negro. Negrito is still something affectionate. Negro is dense. And so this too constitutes part of the language of shop floor life. And I don't think, how do you generate new meaning out of old terms? I don't, you know, again, this is, how does, well, for example, I mean, you know, the most obvious one in the US would be the term, what is it, queer. At what point did queer become a term of pride instead of opprobrium? How did that come to be?
I mean, some of that seems to be the agency of the constituency. I mean, what's interesting in the example you just provided is that that category, right, the terminology is being employed to produce a sense of ethicality of the worker, right? That a good worker, you know, do your civic duty as a worker, clean your stuff up, don't make a mess, don't come drunk, don't, you know? And, I mean, that's, it's just fascinating, like what kinds of resources get called upon in order to constitute what's seen as a kind of subject that is, you know, legible, I guess, for the historical moment.
I think on that note, I'd like to just invite the brave band who's remained fascinated for 2 hours to Linda's nice reception outside. She's got a nice, why don't we just continue the discussion? Thank you very much, Carl.